Hey everyone, my name is Colby Brown and welcome to this short video covering 5 of my favorite ON1 Photo RAW tips for getting the most out of your wildlife images. Now let's go ahead and jump right in. For tip number 1, I want to talk about removing unwanted objects in our images. And I'm going to do so with this image of a female lion taken in Namibia last year. As you can see, there are certain elements of her environment that are sticking into this shot that I think are just distracting and pull away from the importance or significance of this image. Removing these unwanted objects or these distractions can help elevate your images, and oftentimes when we're photographing wildlife out in the wild, we don't have the ability to control just how clean their environment is. So these tips should help you to clean up other images as well, but let's focus on this image to begin with. Now with ON1 Photo RAW, you have 2 main ways to remove these unwanted objects. The first one we're going to talk about is the Retouch Brush, which is also shortcut R, found over here on the left-hand panel. Now this tool is great for removing objects when you have similar texture behind it, such as this string here on the far right-hand corner. We simply click and drag and remove that object. It does a good job because it's not a very complicated object removal. Now when it comes to removing this little piece of brush inside this lion's nose, we have to use the other tool, which is also known as the Perfect Eraser, shortcut Q, found over here on the left-hand side. Now the Perfect Eraser does a great job of removing unwanted objects in complex situations, such as this piece of brush hanging outside this lion's nose. Now once we're ready to move this object, let's go ahead and shrink the size using the parentheses shortcuts to make sure it's the exact size of this brush that we're trying to remove. Once we're ready, let's go ahead and click and drag. And as you can see, it does a pretty good job of removing that object. There you go. With a few quick brush strokes using 2 different tools, we were able to quickly remove some of those distracting elements, which are prevalent in the vast majority of wildlife images that I've taken out in the actual wild. So that's the end of tip 1, removing unwanted objects. Now for tip number 2, I'm going to talk about dynamic contrast and how you can use it to really emphasize and make certain aspects of your image pop and stand out, specifically with this image of a beautiful African elephant taken in Namibia last year. So to begin, let's go ahead and click on the effects panel here in the right-hand module, and then go ahead and click on Add Filter. With that selected, let's go ahead and find Dynamic Contrast. Now you can see dynamic contrast was added to the entire image, and this is not really what I want to do in this situation. Really all I want to do is focus on bringing out the textures and making this elephant here in the middle pop, while not adding in all sorts of other elements or other things to the rest of the image itself. So how do we do that? Let's go ahead and click on the Show Hide Mask option, found right here next to the filter title, and then select Invert in the drop-down menu. Now by inverting this mask, we removed its effect across this image, and this allows us to paint in where we want this effect applied, specifically to the elephant itself. So with my masking brush selected, which is also the shortcut B, and make sure that we have Paint In selected up here at the top under Mode, I can essentially paint in this effect where I want it applied. Once I'm happy with where I painted in this effect onto the elephant, I now need to control its strength, because I don't want the full amount of dynamic contrast showing up on this elephant. I feel it's a little bit too much punch, it's a little bit too much in your face. And I can control that here in the opacity slider here on the right, and what I can do is I can take the slider, move it all the way to the left so that it's at 0, which means that none of the effect has been applied. And then I can slowly move it to the right until I figure out exactly where I'm happy with. Right now this looks about 70%. So we've taken the dynamic contrast effect, we've applied it just to our elephant, and then we further adjusted the strength of that dynamic contrast by moving the opacity slider down. Sometimes I feel a lot of photographers focus more on global adjustments of applying an effect like dynamic contrast across your entire frame, when in reality only certain elements really needed it. So tip number 2, use dynamic contrast, but use it sparingly and use it subjectively across your frame in order to help certain elements or certain textures really pop and stand out. Now for my third tip, I want to talk about the idea of sharpness when it comes to wildlife photography. Now the truth is that long lenses with teleconverters or shooting in dark situations can sometimes lead to images that are a touch soft, or at least not as sharp as you might be used to if you're shooting in beautiful golden light. Now with this image of these 3 cheetah cubs feeding on a kill that its mother took down, about an hour or two before I took this shot, you can see that the main cub here, the one that's standing up, is just a touch too soft. Now I photographed this with a Sony A9 on 100 to 400 with the teleconverter on it, so I'm not actually too surprised that it is a touch soft, especially since it was a little bit dark to begin with. So what do you do with a situation like this? Is the image completely unsalvageable just because it's a touch soft? Not at all. The key is to understanding how and where to apply sharpness back into your frame. Now with ON1 Photo RAW, you have two different ways that you can do this. Now the first option can be found in the Local Adjustments tab, found here on the right-hand side. With that selected, let's go ahead and go down here to the Detail section and take Structure and move that slider a little bit to the right. Now with the masking brush selected and you see a plus right there in the middle of your circle, let's go ahead and paint in this effect where we want it applied. Now right off the bat, we might have sharpened that a little bit too much, so we can come back here to the Structure slider and just pull it back just a little bit. Either way, we've applied a subjective amount of sharpness directly to the cheetah cub to help bring it back into focus. Now, as I mentioned, this isn't the only way to add sharpness back into an image. So let's go ahead and remove this local adjustment by hitting this X in the right-hand panel. And let's make sure we're in the Effects panel, go back to Overall Settings, and here let's go ahead and click on the Add Filter button. Now with all these filter effects, let's go ahead and find Sharpening. And then here you see you have a couple options along with a drop-down menu for a ton of different options you have here to apply sharpening back into your frame. Now as you move your cursor across all these options, you're going to see it apply to your image, so you might get a good idea of how it's going to apply sharpness. But in this situation, I want to go ahead and select Fix Focus. Now just as I said before with the last tip, I don't want to apply this sharpness across the entire frame. Because if I apply sharpness across the entire image, I'm going to add sharpness into some of my shadowed or darker parts of the frame and add noise back into the shot, which is not what I want. In addition to that, I just want to bring attention to this main cheetah and not worry about everything else. So by sharpening just this cheetah, we're going to draw the attention to it rather than everything else into our shot. So let's go ahead and click on the Show View Masking option and then select Invert once again. Now once we've done that and removed the effect across our frame, let's go ahead and make sure that our masking brush is selected once again, and let's go ahead and paint back in to the areas we want to be sharp. Now one of the nice benefits of applying sharpening this way is that if you look over here in the right-hand panel, you have this area here at the bottom called Protect, and you have sliders for shadow, highlights, and skin tones. Now this area allows you to protect those specific areas or those specific luminosities within your frame in the area that you painted in. And in this case, if I go ahead and take the shadow slider and move it to the right, I'm actually going to protect the shadow or the darker parts of the image that I painted over, making sure that I don't apply noise back into those darker shadow parts of the frame that I painted in on this specific cheetah. This is why I prefer this option over the local adjustment brush. You have more settings at your disposal to get your sharpness exactly how you want it. So tip number 3 is understanding how to apply sharpness back into your frames and how you can take slightly soft wildlife images and really bring them back to life. So now that we've talked about sharpness and dynamic contrast, it's now time to talk about noise for tip number 4. How to deal with noise with wildlife images when you're photographing in dark situations, which can be quite often. Now we're going to focus on that in this photograph of a chimpanzee taken in Uganda in East Africa. Now, oftentimes I find myself shooting in bad lighting situations where I have to pump up my ISO not only to gather enough light, but also to use a fast enough shutter speed in order to counter for the use of a really long lens. So what do you do when you have a wildlife image that has a decent amount of noise? Let's walk through it. Now first with this image, let's go ahead and brighten it up just a little bit so that we can see things just a little bit better. Here in the Develop module, we go ahead and take the exposure slider and just move it slightly to the right. Next, let's go ahead and jump into the Effects module, found over here on the right-hand side. And then go ahead and click on Add Filter. Once we've done that, let's go ahead and select Noise Reduction. And the Noise Reduction filter allows us to add a very small blur layer across our frame, because that's essentially what noise reduction is. It's parts of your frame that are either too dark where you added noise in from a high ISO, and you're essentially going to blur over those elements. But if you blur over everything within your frame, you're going to lose texture detail and sharpness, so you have to be very specific about how you apply noise reduction. Now luckily here in ON1 Photo RAW, you have a ton of options, and a lot of them make things so much simpler than a lot of other photo processing applications out there. Here at the top of the panel, you can see we have subtle, strong, blue sky shadows, and a bunch more options. Now, because I want to focus on cleaning up this image and specifically all the noise found in the shadow parts of the frame, all I have to do is come here and select the shadow option, and then go ahead and click on it. Now, in doing so, the settings for this effect are automatically applied not only to my shadows, but also with an emphasis on color noise rather than luminance noise, as you can see by the sliders here on the right. Now, color noise is very prominent, or can be very prominent, in a lot of shadow or darker parts of your frame depending on the sensor that you're using. Now, once we've applied noise, let's go ahead and zoom in to 100% to see how things are being applied within the details of this frame by clicking on the 100 found at the top of your frame, and then go ahead and dragging up to an area you want to see, such as the face of this chimpanzee. Now here we can further adjust the luminance, color, or detail sliders depending on how we want that noise reduction applied, or we can adjust the overall opacity of this effect, which is what I'm going to do. So this is 0, and as we go up, you can see a little bit of the noise get cleaned up in some of these darker fur parts, as well as some of these parts of the background of the frame. Now once I'm happy with those results, I can go ahead and move on to finish processing this image, although we're not going to do that in this specific tip video. So remember, tip number 4, focus on noise reduction, but be very subjective about how you apply it to your frame. In addition, noise reduction can be done as one of the last steps within your workflow process, either just before or just after you've applied your final sharpening. That way you know you're getting good results. Now for our last tip, I want to talk about eyes. Like human subjects, I feel that the strongest connection that we can make with another animal is through the eyes. This is not only a powerful experience to have in real life as the photographer, but one that can be shared properly with those viewing your images as well, depending on how you process your shots. So let's go ahead and begin with this beautiful shot of a male lion taken in Namibia. So to start things off, let's go ahead and bring up the brightness of this image just a little bit. Now once we've done that, let's go ahead and adjust the white balance so that I know that I'm working with the proper tonal colors. Now here in the Develop module, here on the right-hand side panel, there's a section that's titled Color, and we also have Temperature, Tint, Saturation, and Vibrance. This is where we focus on white balance. Now here where it says As Shot, there's a drop-down menu there, so we can go ahead and click on that, select Daylight. That's going to give us a much warmer image, but it's a little bit too warm for me. So let's go ahead and take the temperature slider and move it a little bit to the left, kind of bring down some of those yellow tones. And then take the tint slider and move it slightly to the right to move away from the greens and a little bit more into the magentas. There, now I'm happy with the tones found in this image. So with that being said, let's go ahead and focus on the eyes, because as I said, eyes in this shot are king. So here in the local adjustments panel, found here in the top right-hand corner, you can go ahead and click on it. Once we do that, let's go ahead and zero out the exposure. And now we have the choice to make what kind of adjustments we want to apply to the eyes in the first place. So I'm going to do this by pulling up our exposure just a little bit, pulling up our shadows, and pulling up our saturation. Now with those sliders adjusted, we go ahead and make sure that our masking brush is turned on by hitting the B key, and then we can paint in the effect into our eyes. Now that we've masked in this effect to the eyes, let's go ahead and further refine these adjustments. Here on the right hand side, I can go ahead and bring up the contrast just a little bit, at the same time as pulling up those highlight sliders to really make the brightest parts of those eyes really pop and stand out. Now if I really wanted to brighten them up, I can further do that by pulling up the shadow slider. I still don't want to do it too much to make it look unnatural. Now in addition, we also have the color of those eyes, which can be adjusted either using the saturation slider, which is a little bit more heavy-handed, or the vibrant slider to really kind of pull and bring it up just a little bit. Now if you accidentally realize that you'd painted outside of the eyes, you can go ahead and click up here in the mode at the top of the frame and select Paint Out, and then just go ahead and remove some of that effect where it's been applied where you don't want it. Now let's go ahead and see what this local adjustment looks like when it's turned off. That's before, and that's after. Now it's a subtle change, but an important one. You really don't want to push eyes in images like this too much because it can look really fake really quickly. The key is to bring the focus to the eyes and allow the viewer to make a connection with your subject. So tip number 5, focus on the eyes and use local adjustment brushes in order to really bring out those different elements to allow that viewer to make that connection that is oh so important in capturing people's attention these days. Well, that's it for this short video covering my 5 favorite ON1 Photo RAW tips for getting the most out of your wildlife images. I hope you enjoyed our time together. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you guys soon.